The first person convicted under Hong Kong's national security law has been sentenced to 9 years in prison for incitement to secession and terrorist activities. 24-year-old Tong Ying-kit was convicted earlier this week after driving his motorcycle into 3 riot police in July last year, injuring them. He was carrying a flag with a political slogan reading "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times." The law came into force after a series of mass pro-democracy protests in 2019, some of which turned very violent. We can cross now to Hong Kong and our correspondent there, Danny Vincent. First of all, Danny, talk us through the reaction to this verdict.
Well, since the national security law was introduced, there have been more than 100 people arrested. Today we've seen the first sentencing under this law, and it's I think most people, at least activists here, would say that it's fairly harsh. It's 9 years for a 24-year-old who was convicted earlier this week for terrorism and incitement to secession. I think the significant point about this case is very much about the words written on the flag that he was holding when he rode his motorcycle into a number of police officers on July 1st, 2020, just 24 hours after the new law was introduced. There was a lot of debate in court about what those words actually meant and whether they were essentially inciting separation. Those words were popular words that were used all across Hong Kong during the protest movement in 2019 and 2020. But under this new national security law, we now know that in this particular case, the use of those words is being punishable for 6.5 years. So I think the reaction in Hong Kong is that people will wonder what it means for freedom of speech in this city. Like I said before, those words were very popular. It was a political slogan that was used incredibly widely across the entire city during the protest movement. But I think many will now wonder what it means for freedom of speech in this city, and if people could continue using expressions like this, or would that mean that they're essentially breaking the national security law?
And this is the crux of it, because what you're describing plays into those fears that we heard when this law was introduced about what it actually means, what comes under the umbrella of this law and how vulnerable people are. I imagine people are watching this sentencing very closely.
That's right. People have been paying a lot of attention to this case. When the national security law was introduced originally, the authorities made it very clear that only a small number of people would be targeted by this law. Now, Tong Ying-kit attacked police officers on a motorcycle on the next day after the law was introduced. But I think people will be definitely questioning what it means for the 120 odd other people that have been arrested under this law. The imprisonment, the sentencing regarding to terrorism, in some ways that was expected, the length of time that he's been sentenced to. He could have been sentenced up to life in prison for that crime. But the incitement to secession is something that people will be concerned about here in this city, because some will feel that it means that freedom of speech now is once again under threat here in Hong Kong.
And just to return to the actual sentencing, we're talking about 9 years, but there was talk that he could get up to a life sentence here. So you're saying there's a mixed response as to what he's actually received?
Well, that's right. I mean, when the national security law was introduced, of course, the authorities said it was needed to restore stability to this city. Critics immediately criticised the law. They said the wording was vague. They said the law was incredibly wide-ranging, and they weren't exactly clear what and how the law could be used. One of the fears that people had was that the maximum sentence for violating this law was in fact life in prison. Now, that isn't what's been handed down today, but many activists and many critics will feel that Tong Ying-kit's sentencing is still relatively harsh.
Danny Vincent, thank you for bringing us up to speed with that developing story.